Hello, and thank you for returning. I appreciate some of the kind comments I received about coming back to posting videos after a long hiatus. Today I'm going to talk about the scandalous presentation of graphics President Trump used in that Axios interview on HBO. It's, in fact, un-American. When I say that, I'm being sort of tongue-in-cheek because I'll show you today that the graphics that he presented are actually um, downloadable from a scientific site in the UK based on data collected and curated and quality checked by the European Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So Trump has access to his task force. Trump has access to the US CDC, although he's trying to cut the CDC, it seems, out of the process. And what the best they can do to prepare him for this interview is to download some publicly available imagery from across the pond. I'm also going to show you that these two graphics are actually the same. One of them is just a small subset of the other. So here's Exhibit 1, and it's a line chart with 4 lines showing the number of deaths per case in a number of different locations. Between 13 minutes and 29 seconds and 13 minutes 41 seconds, Trump said right here, the United States is lower in numerous categories. We're lower than the world. We're lower than Europe. Take a look, and then he hands this over to Jonathan, the interviewer. There's a number of things wrong with this. It's not numerous categories. This is a single category. And he read off 3 entities, the U.S., the world, and Europe. There are 4 lines on there. What's the 4th line he's not reading about? And he got confused. I'll show you why. So this is actually the image from that website. As I pointed out, I think I might have mentioned that you can tell it's for sure the same image by some of the methodological points that are printed on the actual graphic, and they match identically. And the interesting thing is that this comparison is the European Union on the top, Europe on the second line. So the European Union is the Economic Political Association, Europe is the geographic continent, and then the world is the 3rd one, and the bottom one is the United States. So let's look at those specific areas where they're the same. I highlighted 3, green to green, blue to blue, yellow to yellow. Blue is a disclaimer about the methodology in the United States. Green is a methodology disclaimer about the European Union. Here it is blown up, and this is my best, clearest image of that part of the graphic from the video. You can't read each word, but you can tell that there are exactly 6 lines underneath it, and the line lengths match exactly the same, and where you see spaces, they occur in exactly the same place. It's the same text. And finally, there's a really important feature of the U.S. relationship that happens in late March, and you can see that feature right here on the graphic. You can also see, if you start looking, some of these squiggly features can actually be seen over here. There's a little bump, for example, right here that occurs right here if you look really carefully. Same graphic. That graphic is really interesting. This is another view of that same graphic. He gives it to Jonathan. And this is now at 13 minutes 42 seconds to 44, so you get a 2-second glimpse of it. Now, so Jonathan gets this at 13:42, having seen it just for a few seconds before that. Within 5 seconds of receiving the graph, Jonathan, the interviewer, correctly points out and says, "Oh, you're doing deaths as a proportion of cases. I'm talking about deaths as a proportion of the population. That's where the U.S. is really bad." And it's true. Those are different statistics. They have different assumptions and have different utilities, and the one that Jonathan is referring to is a much more meaningful and accurate statistic. So he correctly diagnosed the poor statistic being presented to him and reflected back on a more appropriate one. This is the actual source of that image. This is the full part of the website you would have seen, where you can choose countries and you can choose what variables to have it graph. This dotted red line is the box that they excised when they printed that on the sheet of paper for President Trump to take into the interview. They clipped off all this other stuff about where the information came from and what decisions were made about what information to present. when Jonathan says, I'm talking about the proportion of deaths per population, Trump is flummoxed and distressed. And he says, you can't do that. You have to go by the cases. So this is now at minute 14:07, so 7 seconds, 14 minutes. For about 10 seconds, you can see the second graphic here, where he's using the second graphic to make the argument that Jonathan's wrong. His interpretation is wrong, that the graphic presented in the first case was accurate, and Jonathan's interpretation is wrong. And so he reads this off to Jonathan at 14:42. Here's one right here. You take the United States. You take the number of cases and look. We're last, which means we're first. So this is a graph of the number of deaths per case. So a long bar means lots of deaths per case. So if you have 1,000 cases, maybe you have 12% deaths. Whereas if in here you might have 1,000 cases, you might have 6% deaths. So the lower the bar, the fewer deaths per documented case. And that's going to be an important issue. Jonathan responded by saying, well, that's great. That cases, I know you're talking about cases, but the number of deaths in the United States has increased recently. It's now 1,000 a day, even 1,200 a day. And Trump responded that, in fact, that's down from where it was. And they got into a little discussion about the fact that early in the epidemic peak, when it was really bad in the New York area, for example, deaths did hit an average of about 2,000 a day. And then we did the social distancing, and it dropped down to about 500 a day, where it had been floating for a week or two or three. But in the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's grown. And at the time of the interview a week ago, it was 1,000 a day. Now it's about 1,300 a day deaths. So Jonathan's saying, but there are more people dying. And in response, Trump tells Jonathan, you're not reporting it correctly. Again, referring to the cases. And Jonathan calmly replies, I think I am. So again, showing you where this comes from. The left is the actual image. So this big thing here from the website. Those are the four entities being graphed. The European Union and Europe and the world and the U.S. And that's just a bizarre set of comparisons, because Europe and European Union have a great overlap, and both of them are big contributors to the world cases, and the U.S. is another big contributor to the world cases. So these are not independent comparisons, and there's all sorts of interesting philosophical questions about whether these comparisons make any sense, and there are far better ways to make these comparisons. But in any case, so both of these graphics are downloaded from the same website, and this is me showing you that in fact there's the same data. So Exhibit 1 is that line chart on the left. It's showing you the deaths per case from about mid-March, excuse me, through the end of July into early August. So they can go up or they can go down. It depends how the epidemic plays out. The bar chart is simply the snapshot at time at the end, in terms of the relative number of deaths per cases. And I can prove that to you when we do this live in the third video, where I'll actually play this for you live, and I'll show you how you can click on the website and have it switch back and forth between these views. But what I've done is I've taken Exhibit 2 and I've just rotated it. I didn't stretch it, I didn't distort it, and I just laid it up right next to number 1. And you can see very clearly with the 4 lines I've drawn that those 4 bars are simply the altitude or the height or the placement of the 4 lines at the end of the graph. So whereas the graph on the left has several hundred days of information, the graph on the right has the last day of information. It's a subset of what's on the left. So when Trump started with his argument in multiple categories were the best, it turns out that in one category we're the best. It's a bad category to use because it's got huge problems in terms of the assumptions and the statistical comparisons. And he presented it twice in 2 different ways. It doesn't make it 2 different pieces of evidence. Saying it a different way, turning the graph upside down, changing the color scheme doesn't change the data. So in the next video, I want to show you the website. It's actually astonishing. And you can make those graphs, but also a whole bunch of much more useful graphics that help support Jonathan's claim that deaths are increasing and the U.S. is actually doing terribly relative to many, many countries. There are hints about where this comes from on slides 8 and 11. And they will show that Trump's presentation was naive and incorrect. That's the charitable interpretation. If we're being less charitable, we could say it's intentionally misleading and tries to divert attention from the real pattern, which is that hospitalizations are up, deaths are up, cases are up sharply, and the U.S. is going exactly the wrong direction. And it is not under control, as Trump has tried to assert over and over again. Finally, I've really hammered on President Trump today. I tried in the first series of videos before I took my hiatus to stay apolitical and not get into it, but I think that Trump in particular has made this a political issue. Mask wearing, for example, encouraging demonstrators to demonstrate against governors who had shut down states to try to save lives. So two things I wanted to say. One's an expression that I heard today from another scientist who's been talking a lot about COVID on YouTube. And the expression is, masks are critical, not political. The point is that wearing masks will actually help break the transmission chain. Wearing masks is more useful to your neighbor than you. You're using it as a source control of infection. Many people have asymptomatic cases. Others are symptomatic, but long before they show symptoms, they're actually contagious. They're infectious. If you wear a mask, you're much less likely to pass it on to someone else. So masks are critical, not political. And another way of looking at this is, many of us, if we get this, will get a mild case or an asymptomatic case. We might not know when we've had it or how long we had it. But during that period of time, we're going to be highly infectious. Now, if we're wearing a mask all the time and following public health guidelines about social distancing, we're doing everything we can not to infect someone else. If we pull our mask off and we yell at a grocery store and we march up and down, hugs, not masks, and we all get close to each other in bars, some of us are going to be infected and not know it, and are going to spread it to other people. If you're 25 and healthy, you may never know you had it. You may be at very, very low risk. But you're going to contribute to a chain of transmission that's going to get into someone's household, and then their mother or grandmother or aunt is going to die. And that means you are partially responsible for that death. At the end of this epidemic, I don't want to look back and say, maybe I was responsible for some of the death that we've seen. I want to say I did everything I could to prevent those deaths. We're at 160,000. We're going to hit 200,000 probably before October 1st. I would be shocked if we're not at 250,000 by Christmas, maybe even closer to 300,000. This is a terrible epidemic, and it's not over anytime soon. Masks are critical, not political.